Hey there, this video will demonstrate how to create a shooting interaction in Unreal. In previous videos we set up the first person character movement, we've set up the camera movement, jump ability, some other specific actions as well, like sprint and crouch and things like that. This video is going to describe how to set up a shooting action through the left mouse button press. We'll shoot an action, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First thing we want to do is create an action mapping. So we're going to go to Settings, Project Settings. We're going to go down to Inputs over here on the left. And we're going to add an action mapping. And we're going to call this one simply Shoot. We're going to add a mouse action. So we'll do mouse. We'll do left mouse button. So when the left mouse button is pressed, we are going to be able to shoot. That's it. So shoot, left mouse button. Alright, all this will also be in the character blueprint. Then we'll actually create a projectile here in a minute. So in the character blueprint, we're going to create a stand-in for a gun. We're going to do this in the viewport. We have our character blueprint, and here's our camera. We're going to reference that here in a minute as well. We're going to create some basic simple geometry that you can then replace later once you get a more complex gun in here. This will be a simple start. So underneath the components, we're going to add a cylinder. There you go. So it's going to create a basic cylinder. It's going to go ahead and parent it underneath the camera, so it'll follow what the camera does. In the 3D view, I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. We're going to scale this much smaller, maybe 0.25. And then in the, let's see, scale axis Z, let's just do a 1. Might be too large, we'll see. Go move it down, and we'll compile and save and go see what that looks like. So we do hit play. I can't see it yet, so it's in the scene, I just can't see it. So let's go back to our blueprint and go into our object, kind of move it up so we can see it maybe. All right, there we go. So we can see it's kind of following around with us. I need to move it closer or further away from the camera, and then we also can kind of angle it in as well. So this is just a stand-in, but we do want to have a base set up here. Also kind of big, so maybe we'll decrease it even more, 0.2 and 0.2. Try that. Let's compile and save. Kind of move it down here so we maybe can see it at the same time while I'm playing. Yeah, that looks a little bit better here. Alright, maybe we'll escape. Move it out just a little more. Underneath the cylinder, I also want to create a cone. It'll be like the barrel, the end of it. Oops, let's just some cone again. You can rename these as you need to. We'll rotate that 90 degrees, and I will move it out. And we're going to scale this down, so we'll do 1 by 1 by 1. 25, there you go. Alright, we'll move it over, kind of center it. Let's actually maximize this so I can see it a little easier. Center it to the center of that, so let's say 1.5, 1.5, and we'll kind of pull it back some. And let's see what that looks like. Alright, here we go. So we got a basic object. If we wanted to add like a scope to this or whatnot, let's see, we can duplicate this object. Select that, choose duplicate. That'll be a parent underneath. And maybe we'll say 0.5, 0.05 by 0.05. There you go. So a little scope or something like that. I don't know. This is just a stand-in, so it doesn't really matter. 0.33. Maybe I'll add like a cube for like the holder of this scope. 0.05. Let's do 0.1. Move it over here. Move it over there. There you go. Alright, so let's do one for this. There you go, so maybe two. It's going this way, so we'll go 4 or 5, and then we'll do, it's too much there on the thickness, so we'll do 0.5. That'll work. And then maybe this one is 3.3, and then we can move down. Alright, might need to whoops, decrease the movement snaps to 1, put it back up to 10 now that's in place. Now let's go compile and save, and let's look at it. Yeah, so I can kind of see that scope there. I think it's alright. Maybe I'll move it around a little bit more, but this is just a stand-in, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah, move it down the barrel a little more. There we go. Yeah, why not? That would be good for now. Alright, so that's just a stand-in for the gun itself. Alright, we're going to rotate this in a little bit. We're going to make sure these other two objects are childs of that cylinder, so that way when I rotate the overall cylinder, it rotates everything. So we're just going to rotate this in maybe just 5 degrees. So let's put our angle snap down to 5 degrees, rotate it in slightly. What we're looking for is that it's going to be aimed towards the center of my composition. That looks pretty good. Maybe it's still a little bit too big in my composition, but I think that's a good start for right now. So angled in just for 5 degrees, so it looks like it's pointing towards the center of where the reticle might be. Alright, we're going to add a blank scene node. This is going to be for where the projectile is going to come out, so where it's going to shoot an object. So we're going to do add component, and we're going to call it scene. The scene is a empty game object. And we're going to call this one projectile ref. Whoop, didn't spell correctly. Try again. Projectile reference. Alright, so this will give me a 3D object or transform, but there's no visual object that's created. Let's put this back down to 5 so we can kind of move it. There you go. Move it a little bit further away, out here some. And this is just an empty object, and I'm going to use a reference where to shoot the projectile out of. Alright, so we're ready to go for right now. Compile and save. The next thing we need to create is a projectile. So we're going to right click in our characters folder, blueprint class, and I'm going to add an actor blueprint. So this is an object that needs to move and animate independently. So we're going to call this just an actor blueprint. We're going to title this BP underscore projectile. Okay. All right, we'll open that up. And we're going to create a couple things in here before we add it to the actions of the character blueprint. So if we want just a simple ball object to be the projectile, then this is how we'll set this up. Then we'll come back and talk about a more specific object that would need movement and rotate to it, so more complex static mesh or whatnot. Alright, so one thing we want to do first is a collision. So let's add a sphere collision. So sphere collision. There we go. And I'm just going to call this one cull for collision. And then underneath that, I also want to add a sphere. This is just a preview sphere. That's not an actual object. So I just want to add a sphere in here. There you go. And let me lock my scale and then put 0.8. Let's try 0.6. There you go, that works. So 0.6 is just inside of the collision. So that scales the sphere down. The sphere is a child of the collision. So if not, you can just click and drag this and parent it underneath the collision object if you wanted to. Alright, so the collision I want to select the collision object, and underneath the collision drop down, I want to change collision preset to block all dynamic. As default, it's under overlap all. We want it to block all dynamic. And then the sphere itself, I want to change the collision preset to overlap all. Let's just do overlap all dynamic. That's fine. You can also set this to no collision. That would work as well. So the collision itself is set to block all dynamic. The sphere static mesh is set to no collision, or overlap all, but no collision works. Alright, so we want to add a movement component that gives me the option to propel this object in a particular direction. So let's go to Add Component, and we're going to type in Projectile Movement. Alright, and we'll just leave it named Projectile Movement. So these are the settings that allow us to move an object when a keyboard button is pressed. We want to change a couple of things. We want to change the initial speed, which is how fast the velocity of the object, as the game starts. And then after the game starts, we want to allow it to have a constant velocity of 200, or at least a velocity of 200. So down here where it says velocity, I'm going to change that to from 1 in the x-axis, which would be perpendicular to the character. So it's the right direction of the character. Velocity of 200 for x, and then initial speed will be 2,000. Now you can play with that to make it faster or shorter or slower, whatever you might want to do. You can test this out by zooming out and clicking the Simulate button. There you go. So you can see how fast that is. That'll be the speed of the object. You can see it'll take gravity. Gravity will take a hold of it, drop it down as well. So you can crank that up or slow that down. Alright, so let's compile and save. Alright, so now we're going to add this projectile to the character blueprint. So let's open up our character blueprint again. And we're going to go in the event graph to a blank area that we haven't used so far, so maybe underneath our jetpack or whatnot, whatever else you might have over here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose shoot. And I'm going to find my action event called shoot that I created earlier. Move it down a little. And from the character blueprint, the action shoot event, I'm going to drag off of pressed, and I'm going to choose add spawn actor from class. So spawn actor from class. Basically this is going to look outward for a blueprint class, and I'm going to choose the class right now. So if I click class, select class, now I'm going to type in projectile, and I'm going to select my projectile I just created. Alright, so I need a location, so I'm going to drag out from spawn transform. Let's move this over here a little more. I'm going to drag out from spawn transform, drag out from that, and I'm going to say make transform. I get a transform node. I need to move everything over a little more here. Okay, so from that I need a reference of my projectile. So here's my projectile reference, what I created in the viewport of my character. It's right here in front of the gun. So in my graph I want to drag that projectile reference in here. And we need some more room, so let's keep moving this over here. So for my projectile reference, I need to drag out from that and choose get world location. Tells me within my world space where that's going to be. And that's going to get connected up to the location of this make transform. There we go. Alright, so it's going to shoot my projectile from this projectile reference location. And for the rotation, I also need to look at my camera. So I'm going to drag in a reference for my camera. So we'll say get a reference for our camera. and I need to drag out from my camera and choose Get World Rotation. And that goes into the rotate of Make Transform. So that'll determine the position and the rotation that this projectile should be shot out of the gun. Alright, let's play, or compile and save, and let's go see how this plays. So if I hit play, and I click move around, if I click left click, my ball will now shoot through the surface. Okay, or shoot out of my gun. Alright, so that's the default setting to get the objects to shoot out of the gun. The gun might be too large and too big of a space, but it shoots the weapon out. I've got some issues that after it shoots, it's not actually colliding with anything. Collides with something, and it's not bouncing off of a surface right, so we got to go back and correct that. So let's go take a look at that. So first let's go look at our projectile. Make sure our collisions block all dynamic. Okay. Good there. We do need to create one more thing here. And that is in the event graph of our projectile. We need to tell it to projectile to stop to set up physics. So after it collides with something, instead of going through the ground, we want it to apply physics and allow it to kind of bounce and hit on top of the ground surface there. So in here we're going to select our projectile movement, and down the bottom of the details panel there's a on projectile stop. So I'm going to create that, and that adds it to my event graph. Alright, so from the executable of the on projectile stop, I'm going to drag out, I'm going to choose set simulate physics. I need to choose of which one. So we want to set simulate physics of the collision. Alright, so let's compile and save. Let's go test that out. So now if I shoot, still not colliding, so we'll correct that, see if we need to correct that in a second. We need to get the collide first, and there's an issue that sometimes comes up. In the projectile, let's take our collision object and let's drag that to the top default scene route. There you go. That removes the default scene route. Now let's just go make sure block all dynamics selected, compile and save. So if we remove that default scene route, let's see if that corrected it now. Alright, so it's doing it, it's creating it, but it's no longer in space. So that might mean is if we draw on it, you can see it's actually, the ball itself is too close to the gun. So I can't actually even apply physics to it because it's too close to the gun. Let's go back to our player character, go to the viewport, and let's move our projectile reference out further away. Do it right there. And let's play and save, or compile and save. Now let's try. There we go. So now it's shooting out, but now it's sticking to the ground. So we just need to go back into our projectile and then make sure we're simulating physics. In the projectile, in the event graph, on the projectile stop, set simulate physics to the collision. It's just not checked. So let's checkbox simulate physics. Compile and save. Now if we back out, we hit play. There we go. So now that's simulating the physics, hitting things, bouncing off of any kind of object, shoot up in the air, and bounce and collide. There you go. Alright. We can actually go into the collision options underneath the physics, and we can adjust a couple things. We can add some mass to this. So if I click on mass, I can increase that mass. Let's increase this to like 300. And let's put a little bit of linear dampening on that. Let's just try 3. I think that might be too much. Linear dampening to 3, mass to 300. And let's compile and save. And now let's see what happens. There we go. So that linear dampening is too much. But I didn't want it to kind of continue rolling as much. So let's back up. Let's lower that linear dampening back down. Here's my collision. Put that linear dampening to like 1 instead of 3. Now let's go test. Here we go. So it'll bounce some, slowly stop rolling after a while. If I want it to roll less, then I can increase the mass more. Potentially increase the linear dampening more, so maybe like 1.5, 400 for mass. There you go. And we'll hit play. There you go. So it's not going to bounce around as much. Slow down more. But that's how we can set up a simple objects collision. We can take that one step further and add a custom object to this as well. So let's repeat the process with a custom static mesh. I don't currently have any static meshes in here, so one thing you can do is go to the add import, go up to add feature or content pack, and let's do content packs, and I'm just going to use the starter content and add that to my project. We didn't talk about adding starter content before now, but we can add some starter content that has some default materials, default static meshes, default sound effects, things like that as well, default particle effects as well. We're going to use those right now. So this will give me some meshes that I can use and a couple other things that we're going to use. Alright, so let's right click again. We'll just recreate the process with a custom static mesh. We're going to do a blueprint class. We're going to do an actor. We'll say BP projectile. We'll call this one rock because there's a rock projectile. BP projectile rock. Alright, let's actually do right click. So we'll do right click to create a separate shoot as far as shooting this rock. Whoop, not plugins. So we're going to go back into project settings. We're going to go to inputs and we'll add another one and we'll say alt shoot. And this one we're going to be right mouse button. Right mouse button. Okay, so we'll have a left shoot and right shoot. Alright, now BP projectile rock. We're going to use the same exact shoot reference. So what we're going to do here is add a collision, and this time we're going to use a box collision. So we're going to do a box collision. I'm going to go ahead and remove the default scene root by clicking on the box and dragging up to default scene root. That removes the root there. And then underneath the box, I'm going to add a static mesh. So with the static mesh, I'm just going to leave it as static mesh. That's going to be a parent or a child of the box. With that static mesh selected in the details panel, I'm going to come over here to the static mesh section and let's add the rock. So I'm going to type in rock. So this SM rock is a object, a mesh that was part of that starter content. So I'm going to lower the size of this. We'll do 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. So that's probably still too big. 0.25. I'll try that. I think that should be all right. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. There we go. So we will do 0, 0 there. So 90 degrees in the y-axis. Going to move it back so that it's relatively in the center of the collision box. And then back on the collision box, and I need to adjust the collision box shape so that it fits the look of this static mesh. So let's look at the shape box extends. And we can scale this out a little bit. That looks pretty good actually. And then the other two for X was what I was scaling. Y, we can scale this in some. That looks pretty good. And then Z, we'll scale that down. It roughly reaches the corners. That looks pretty good. Alright, let's go ahead and compile and save what we're doing so far. Alright, so we're going to add that projectile movement again. So we're going to click on Add Component, and we're going to do Projectile. It's our projectile movement. We're going to repeat that. We'll do an initial velocity of 2,000, and you can change this according to your object as well. And then the velocity x is 200. And simulate that. You see we're going in the right direction. Looks pretty good. We'll also add a rotating component. So basically this object can rotate as it is projecting the motion as well. So add a rotating movement. And up here at the top we have rotate rate. And we're going to do an x rotation rate. Let's turn 0 for z. So x is going to be, let's try 360. And then y is going to be 0, z is going to be 0. So let's try to get an angle so we can watch it. There we go. So that's the right angle. It's spinning clockwise. So that was x of 360, y 0, z 0. And now we can add a couple other things to kind of make this more fancy. We can also come in here and add a particle system. Particle system. That'll parent it underneath the box. And the particle template, there's a couple ones that come shipped with that starter content. Let's just use explosion. Nope, let's use fire. Here we go, that'll work. So we'll use fire. Try that one for right now. So as it flies away, it'll have a fire trail behind it. Pretty cool. Alright, so let's compile and save. And we don't need this. Actually, let's go ahead to the event graph and let's go ahead and add our adjustments that we need here. So with our projectile movement, I'm going to go down to the bottom of the details panel and add our on projectile stop. So from that, we're going to drag out and we're going to add our set simulate physics of the box collider. Move that down. And we're going to turn simulate on. We also want it to stop rotating as well. So from the set simulate physics, I'm going to drag out. Oh, actually, I think I need to do my rotating movement. Yep, here we go. So rotating movement, let's drag that in from the components. And then from rotating movement, I'm going to drag out and I'm going to choose set rotation rate. Here we go. All right, I'm going to leave all the values at 0, which basically means when it hits the physics, I want you to stop, hits an object and simulates the physics, I want you to stop rotating it and allow it to simulate physics. All right, so this actually needs to go before it simulates physics. So let's hold down the Alt key and click off of the simulate physics execution. And we'll move those over a little more here. And then we'll input our set here. Go, move that down. So from the on projectile stop, we're going to drag from executable to the set of our rotation rate. And then the set of the rotation rate goes into simulate physics. There you go. So there's that setup. Compile and save. And let's go set this up within our character blueprint. So let's take our character blueprint again. This is our shoot action, so let's comment that. Shoot. There you go. So underneath that, we're going to type Alt Shoot. And we're going to add our action mapping for Alt Shoot. And we're going to repeat this action here. So we're going to drag out from pressed. And we're going to choose spawn actor from class. Drag it way over here. From the spawn actor class, we're going to select our projectile rock. From the spawn transform, I'm going to drag out and choose make transform. Determines the location. We can actually take our projectile ref, get world location, and camera, get world rotation. We can copy and paste those down here. I could have pasted the whole thing, but and then connect these up. So projectile ref, get world location, return value goes into location. Camera ref, get world rotation, return value goes to rotation. Here we go. So that should work. I'm going to go test this out. Oh, it did by accident. So there's my ball, and there is my the box collider with the projectile being shot out. Actually, one thing I forgot to do is go turn on the collision for the box colliders, because it's actually just going through everything. So let's go back and do that. So for the projectile rock, let's go into the box collider, and let's change that collision preset to block all dynamic. And then the static mesh, let's change the collision preset to no collision. Compile and save. Now let's go test again. Alright, so there's left click. There's right click, that's working as well. And as it hits the surface, it's going to simulate physics and kind of spin around. So the other thing is that the particle system is like continuing to activate. Maybe I don't want that. Maybe I want to stop with the particle system after a certain time. Come back in my projectile for the rock and make a couple other adjustments. Maybe we'll add a little bit more mass to the collision. So let's change mass, and then we're gonna, let's see, this will be 500, a little bit bigger. And we'll say the same linear dampening, so 1.5. So a heavier object than the ball. Compile and save. And in the event graph, I want to, after I simulate physics, I want to deactivate the particle system. So I can right or left click out of the set simulate physics, and I can say deactivate, and tell it what to deactivate. I want to deactivate the particle system. That basically just turns off the particle system from creating new particles. Okay, let's add a little bit of delay in here as well. So let's just move that over. So before, I don't want it on contact to deactivate. So let's drag out and let's add a delay. So let's just type in delay. And this is a per second delay. So 0.2, let's change that to 0.5. So a half second delay before it starts deactivating that particle system. All right, let's compile and save. Close this out, hit play. So move around. So it hits the surface, 0.5 seconds later, it's going to deactivate that particle, and it's no longer going to have that particle running anymore. Now that's just a choice. So now we have a left click to shoot a ball and a right click to shoot a static mesh. And everything should kind of interact and work properly. Alright, so that'll wrap up this video on how to create projectiles. There's two different ways, and someone would like to create different kind of projectiles.